Naomi Brooks had mastered the art of being invisible, moving through the gilded halls of the Lansbury Hotel with quiet efficiency, serving champagne to people who never bothered to learn her name. But when billionaire Edward Lansbury strode into his own restaurant that night, with his cruel smile and mockery ready on his lips, he made her an offer that was designed to humiliate $100,000 if she could serve him in Chinese. And as the entire dining room fell silent, cameras turned and laughter echoed off crystal chandeliers, waiting for the poor waitress to stumble and fail. There was one thing that Edward Lansbury didn't know about the woman holding his water glass. She wasn't just another face in the service industry. She was the daughter of a man whose legacy he had stolen. And today, every word she spoke in those 9 flawless languages would become the first crack in his empire. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The evening air carried the scent of expensive perfume and aged wine as Naomi Brooks moved gracefully between the tables of the Lansbury Hotel's rooftop restaurant. 28 floors above the Manhattan streets, the glittering space hummed with conversations in half a dozen languages. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths, and the skyline stretched endlessly beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Naomi balanced a tray with practiced ease, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her white blouse pressed and spotless. She'd worked here for 2 years now, ever since her world had fallen apart. The job paid enough to cover rent and helped with her mother's medical bills, though barely. She'd learned to move through these rooms like a shadow, unnoticed and unheard, exactly how the wealthy guests preferred their servers. "Excuse me, miss," called a woman at table 7. Naomi approached with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman, draped in pearls, spoke in rapid French to her companion before turning to Naomi. "We'd like to know if the duck is prepared traditionally or with some fusion twist." Naomi responded in fluent French, explaining the preparation method with perfect pronunciation. The woman's eyebrows lifted in surprise, and she exchanged a glance with her dining partner before nodding curtly. Naomi took their order and moved away, aware that even her competence could sometimes feel like an intrusion to people like this. She returned to the service station where Lila Chen, the hotel manager, was reviewing seating charts. Lila was 40, composed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd always been kind to Naomi in a distant, professional way. "Busy night ahead," Lila said quietly. "Mr. Lansbury is dining here tonight with investors." Naomi's hands paused briefly as she organized napkins. Edward Lansbury. The owner himself rarely appeared in his own hotel's restaurant, preferring to operate from his penthouse office or jet off to one of his other properties around the world. "I'll make sure everything runs smoothly," Naomi replied. Lila studied her for a moment. "He can be difficult. Don't take anything personally." Before Naomi could respond, a shift rippled through the restaurant. Conversations dropped to whispers. The pianist's fingers hesitated on the keys before resuming with renewed vigor. Edward Lansbury had arrived. He swept in with an entourage of 4 bodyguards and half a dozen people in expensive suits. Edward was 50, tall and angular, with silver hair combed back and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. British by birth, American by choice, he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never been told no in decades. "Table 12, of course," he announced, not asking. The hostess scrambled to accommodate him, even though the table was reserved for another party. Edward dropped into his chair like he owned the air itself, which, technically, he did. Naomi was assigned to his section. She approached with a water pitcher and menus. "Good evening, Mr. Lansbury. Welcome." He glanced up at her, his eyes sliding over her face without really seeing her. "Water, no ice. And tell the kitchen I want the chef to personally oversee my meal tonight, None of this assembly line nonsense. Of course, sir. Naomi poured his water with steady hands. One of the men at Edward's table chuckled. Still demanding perfection everywhere you go, Edward? Why settle for less? Edward replied, his accent a blend of British refinement and American directness. I didn't build an empire by accepting mediocrity. He waved dismissively toward Naomi. That'll be all. She retreated, feeling the familiar weight of invisibility settle over her shoulders. This was the life she'd chosen, or rather, the life that had chosen her after her father died. After the university informed her that without his income, her scholarship wasn't enough. After the medical bills started arriving for her mother's treatments. The evening progressed with the usual rhythm. Naomi moved between tables, taking orders, delivering dishes, refilling glasses. At table 9, a group of diplomats discussed international trade agreements in French. She understood every word but kept her expression neutral and professional. Then she heard Edward's voice cut through the ambient noise. A waitress who speaks French. What's next, Sanskrit? Naomi turned. Edward was looking directly at her, a smirk playing on his lips. His entire table had fallen silent, all eyes on her. She realized she must have been caught responding to the diplomats in their language. I apologize if I overstepped, sir, Naomi said quietly, her tone even. Oh, no apology needed, Edward continued, louder now, performing for his audience. It's just surprising. Tell me, where did a waitress learn French? Community college, online videos? His guests laughed uncomfortably. The diplomat who'd spoken to her in French shifted in his seat, looking away. No one wanted to contradict Edward Lansbury in his own establishment. Naomi felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her face calm. A voice echoed in her memory, her father's voice from years ago. Respect is not what they give, it's what you carry. I picked it up over the years, she replied simply. Will there be anything else? Edward leaned back in his chair, warming to his game now. Several nearby tables had stopped eating to watch the exchange. You know what? This gives me an idea for some after-dinner entertainment. He pulled out his wallet with exaggerated slowness, extracting a crisp $50 bill. He held it up like a prize. I'll give $50 to anyone on staff who can spell entrepreneur correctly. Anyone? A busboy near the kitchen door looked down at his feet. A hostess pretended to be deeply engaged with her computer screen. Edward laughed. Come now, don't be shy. Easy money. He turned his attention back to Naomi. What about you? Feel lucky? Before she could respond, Lila appeared at Edward's elbow. Mr. Lansbury, perhaps we should focus on your dinner experience. The chef has prepared something special. I'm sure he has, Edward said, waving her off. He was enjoying this too much to stop. His eyes fixed on Naomi again, and something in his expression sharpened. Actually, I have a better idea. Tell you what, I'll give you $100,000 if you can serve me in Chinese. Mandarin, specifically. Think you can handle that? The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the piano player's hands stilled above the keys. $100,000. The number hung in the air like a challenge and an insult combined. Naomi stood perfectly still, meeting Edward's gaze. His smirk widened. He was certain she'd either refuse or embarrass herself trying. Either way, he'd proven his point about knowing one's place. Her mind raced. $100,000 would pay off 6 months of her mother's treatment. It would give her breathing room, maybe even let her go back to school part-time. But more than the money, something deeper stirred inside her. A memory of standing beside her father at the United Nations, watching him bridge entire cultural divides with nothing but words and empathy. She could take this man's money and his mockery, or she could walk away and let him think he'd won. Naomi, Lila whispered urgently, close enough that only she could hear. Don't engage. He does this to everyone. It's not worth your job. Naomi nodded slowly. but her eyes never left Edward's. She saw the certainty there, the absolute belief that he'd cornered her, that she was just another prop in his performance of superiority. "I'll consider your generous offer, Mr. Lansbury," she said finally, her voice steady. "For now, would you like to hear the evening's specials?" Edward's smirk faltered for just a second. He'd expected either immediate capitulation or refusal. This measured response threw him off balance. "The specials? Fine." He waved his hand. "Make it quick." Naomi described each dish with professional precision, then took his order and those of his guests. As she walked away, she could feel Edward's eyes following her, reassessing. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She served meals, cleared plates, smiled politely at patrons who barely saw her. But inside, something had shifted. Edward Lansbury had meant to humiliate her, to put her in what he considered her place. Instead, he'd reminded her of everything she'd been forced to set aside. When her shift ended near midnight, Naomi rode the subway home to her small apartment in Queens. The contrast between the glittering hotel and her neighborhood was stark. Cracked sidewalks replaced marble floors. The scent of expensive cuisine gave way to the smell of fried food from the bodega on the corner. She climbed 3 flights of stairs to her apartment and locked the door behind her. The space was tiny but clean, decorated with remnants of her old life. Books in multiple languages lined makeshift shelves. A photo of her father stood on the small dining table, frozen in time at a United Nations event, his smile proud and warm. Naomi sat down and pulled a dusty notebook from the shelf. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with linguistic notes in her own handwriting. Arabic verb conjugations, Mandarin characters with pronunciation guides, Swahili phrases, Russian grammar rules. The accumulated knowledge of years of passionate study, all abandoned when tragedy struck. She traced her fingers over the writing, remembering late nights in the university library, her father's encouragement, the dreams she'd once held of becoming a translator like him, of using language to connect people across cultures, to build understanding where walls existed. Her phone sat on the table beside the photo. She picked it up and scrolled through her files until she found the folder marked Dad. Inside were dozens of audio recordings he'd made for her over the years. Study aids, encouragement, stories from his work interpreting at the United Nations. She pressed play on one titled, For When You Doubt. Her father's voice filled the small apartment, warm and familiar despite the years since she'd heard it in person. "Naomi, my brilliant girl, if words build nations, imagine what your voice could build. You have a gift, not just for language, but for listening. That's rarer than you know. When you speak, you don't just translate words, you translate hearts." Tears welled in her eyes. She missed him with an ache that never fully faded. He'd died 3 years ago in a car accident, sudden and senseless. One moment he was alive, planning her graduation party. The next he was gone, and with him went the financial support that made her education possible. Naomi wiped her eyes and stood. She walked to the small mirror hung beside the door and studied her reflection. The same face Edward Lansbury had dismissed without a second thought, but she knew what he didn't. Behind this face was a mind that spoke 9 languages fluently. A heart that remembered every lesson her father had taught her about dignity, compassion, and the power of being truly heard. She straightened her shoulders and spoke softly in Mandarin, reciting a classical phrase about patience and justice. Her pronunciation was perfect, her tone conveying nuances that most native speakers would miss. Her reflection looked back at her with new determination. Edward Lansbury had thrown down a challenge, meant as mockery. But Naomi was going to respond on her own terms, in her own time. Not for the money, though she desperately needed it, but for something more important. For her father's memory. for every person who'd ever been dismissed based on appearances. And for herself, to prove that she hadn't lost everything when her old life crumbled. Tomorrow she would return to that glittering restaurant. And when the moment was right, she would speak. The morning sun barely penetrated the narrow streets of Queens as Naomi prepared for her shift. She'd slept fitfully, her mind replaying Edward Lansbury's mocking challenge and her father's recorded words in equal measure. She dressed with extra care, pressing her white blouse until every crease disappeared, polishing her shoes until they gleamed. As she rode the subway into Manhattan, she listened to another of her father's recordings through her earbuds. This one was from her sophomore year at Columbia, when she'd won a regional linguistics competition. "I'm proud of you, Naomi," his voice said. "But remember, language is never about showing off. It's about connection. Every word you speak should build a bridge, not a wall." She arrived at the Lansbury Hotel 45 minutes before her shift. The morning crew was setting up the restaurant, and the space looked different in daylight. Less glamorous, more utilitarian. Lila stood near the host stand, reviewing the day's reservations. "You're here early," Lila observed, her tone neutral, but her eyes curious. "I wanted to be prepared," Naomi replied. "I saw Mr. Lansbury has a private breakfast meeting scheduled." Lila's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're volunteering to serve it? If that's acceptable." There was a long pause. Lila studied her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Last night was uncomfortable. Are you sure you want to put yourself in that position again?" Naomi met her gaze steadily. "I'm sure." Something shifted in Lila's expression. A flicker of respect or perhaps recognition. "All right. But Naomi, whatever you're planning, be careful. Edward Lansbury doesn't forgive people who make him look foolish." "I'm not planning anything," Naomi said quietly. "I'm just going to do my job." 2 hours later, Edward arrived with 3 men in tailored suits, clearly investors or business partners. They settled at a private table in the Kiowa corner, surrounded by windows offering views of the city skyline. Naomi approached with water and menus, her heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Edward barely glanced at her. "Coffee. Black. And tell the kitchen I want the smoked salmon eggs Benedict, but replace the hollandaise with something lighter. I don't need that much butter this early." Naomi wrote down his order, then turned to the other guests. As Edward continued talking business with his associates, she repeated his order back to confirm it. But she did so in flawless Mandarin. The words flowed naturally, with perfect tonal inflection. She used the formal register appropriate for a business setting, her pronunciation crisp and accurate. Edward's head snapped up. His associates looked confused. One of them, an older man with gray temples, spoke Mandarin and clearly understood what she'd said. His expression registered surprise. "What was that?" Edward demanded. "I was confirming your order, sir," Naomi replied in English, her voice calm. "The smoked salmon eggs Benedict with a lighter sauce instead of hollandaise." "You were speaking Chinese." It wasn't a question. His tone carried disbelief and irritation in equal measure. "Yes, sir. You mentioned yesterday that you'd pay $100,000 if I could serve you in Chinese. I thought I'd demonstrate that I can." The table fell silent. Edward's jaw tightened. He'd expected her to either forget about his challenge or fail spectacularly if she tried. This composed competence caught him completely off guard. "Cute trick," he said finally, recovering his smirk. "Parroting back some phrases you memorized. But I said serve me in Chinese, not imitate me like a trained parrot." Naomi didn't react to the insult. Instead, she simply pulled out her order pad and began writing the entire order in Mandarin characters, the strokes precise and practiced. When she finished, she showed it to Edward's associate, the one who'd understood her earlier. "Is this correct?" she asked him in Mandarin, then repeated the question in English. The man examined the writing, his expression thoughtful. "It's perfect," he said slowly. "Your characters are excellent. Where did you study?" Before Naomi could answer, Edward cut in. "That's enough language lessons for one morning. Just bring the food." Naomi nodded and walked away, feeling Edward's eyes boring into her back. She could sense his confusion, the way his mind was recalculating who she might be. The other staff members watched her with wide eyes, clearly wondering what was happening. In the kitchen, the head chef looked at her order ticket with the Mandarin characters. "What is this?" "Mr. Lansbury's order," Naomi said. "Same as what I told you in English." The chef shook his head, amused. "You're full of surprises, Naomi." As she waited for the food to be prepared, Lila appeared beside her. "That was bold." "It was honest," Naomi replied. Edward looked unsettled. "That doesn't happen often." Lila paused, then added quietly, "There's more to you than you've let on, isn't there?" Naomi didn't answer directly. "We all have stories we don't share at work." The breakfast service proceeded smoothly. Edward ate in tense silence while his associates made polite conversation. When Naomi returned to clear the plates, Edward stopped her. "Where did you really learn Mandarin?" His tone had shifted from mockery to something harder to read. "My father was a translator," Naomi said simply. "He believed in the power of communication." "Was?" "He passed away 3 years ago." Edward's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort, but it vanished quickly. "Well, knowing a language or two doesn't change your station in life, remember that." Naomi gathered the plates without responding. As she turned to leave, she heard Edward's associate say quietly, "That was unnecessarily harsh, even for you." Edward's only response was to change the subject back to business. The rest of the morning passed in a strange tension. Word had spread among the staff about the Mandarin exchange, and Naomi felt their curious stares. She kept her head down and focused on her work, but she was aware of how the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer quite invisible. During her lunch break, she stepped outside for air. The city noise enveloped her. Car horns, construction, the rumble of the subway beneath the streets. She found a quiet spot near the hotel's service entrance and pulled out her phone. There was a missed call from Dr. Farouk Hassan, her former mentor from Colombia. She'd studied under him during her undergraduate years before everything fell apart. He'd been kind when she'd had to withdraw, telling her the door was always open if she wanted to return. She called him back. "Naomi." His warm voice answered immediately. "Thank you for returning my call. I was thinking about you recently. How are you, Dr. Hassan?" "Busy with the usual academic chaos, but I wanted to ask if you ever finished that research paper you were working on, the one about language as a bridge of empathy." Naomi's throat tightened. That paper had been her passion project, combining linguistics with psychology and cultural studies. She'd been 3/4 finished when her father died, and her world imploded. "No," she said quietly. "I never got to complete it." "That's a shame." "It was brilliant work, Naomi. Your insights into how multilingual communication affects conflict resolution were genuinely groundbreaking." "Thank you. Maybe someday I'll finish it." "I hope so. The world needs voices like yours." He paused. "Are you doing all right, really?" She looked up at the towering hotel, at the world of wealth and power she moved through like a ghost. "I'm managing. If you ever want to talk, or if there's anything I can do, I know. Thank you, Dr. Hassan." After they hung up, Naomi stood for a long moment, holding her phone. The conversation had stirred up memories and regrets she usually kept buried. Her father's death had stolen more than just his presence. It had stolen her future, or at least the future she'd imagined. That evening, as she prepared for the dinner shift, She overheard two staff members talking near the supply closet. "Did you hear what happened this morning? Naomi totally spoke Chinese to Mr. Lansbury." "No way. Really?" "Yeah," and he looked completely thrown off. "Someone said she wrote the whole order in Chinese characters, too." Naomi moved past them without acknowledging the conversation. Let them talk. It didn't change anything. But she was wrong. It had changed something. At table 6, a young waiter named Marcus was struggling with a guest who spoke very limited English. The guest was becoming frustrated, his voice rising as he tried to explain something about his food allergy. Marcus looked panicked, unable to understand. Naomi recognized the language immediately, Arabic. She approached smoothly. "May I help?" she asked Marcus quietly. "Please, I can't understand what he needs." Naomi turned to the guest and spoke in fluent Arabic, her dialect matching his. She explained that Marcus didn't speak Arabic, but wanted to help. The guest's face flooded with relief, and he quickly described his severe shellfish allergy. Naomi translated for Marcus, who nodded gratefully and rushed to inform the kitchen. The guest thanked Naomi profusely in Arabic, his earlier frustration melting into appreciation. She smiled and assured him they'd take care of everything. As she turned to leave, she found Edward Lansbury standing 10 feet away, watching her. He'd witnessed the entire exchange. Their eyes met across the restaurant floor. His expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in the way he looked at her. No longer dismissive, now calculating. He walked over slowly. "That was Arabic." "Yes, sir." "So you speak Mandarin and Arabic." He said it slowly, as if testing the words. "What else?" Naomi could have listed them: French, Spanish, Russian, Swahili, Portuguese, Italian. 9 languages in total, each one learned with love and dedication, each one a gift from her father's belief in her potential. But something stopped her from revealing everything at once. "Enough to help when needed," she said instead. Edward's eyes narrowed. "Who are you really?" "I'm Naomi Brooks. I work here as a waitress." Nobody who speaks like that works as a waitress by choice. The comment stung because it was true. But Naomi kept her expression neutral. Life takes unexpected turns. He studied her for another long moment, then pulled out his phone and typed something. "I'm having my assistant look into your background. I don't like mysteries in my establishment." A cold weight settled in Naomi's stomach, but she didn't let it show. "You're welcome to look. I have nothing to hide." Edward walked away without another word, but the threat hung in the air. Naomi finished her shift with a growing sense of unease. She'd wanted to prove something, to reclaim a piece of her dignity. But now she'd drawn attention she couldn't afford. That night, back in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Edward's words. "I don't like mysteries." What would his assistant find? Her academic records? Her father's work at the United Nations? The fact that she'd once been on track for a PhD in linguistics before financial ruin forced her to drop out. She got up and opened her laptop, navigating to old files she rarely looked at anymore. There were photos from her university days, papers she'd written, presentations she'd given at academic conferences, evidence of a life she'd once lived. And there, buried in a folder marked Dad's Work, were copies of some of her father's old United Nations documents. Translations he'd done, reports he'd filed. She'd kept them as mementos, never really examining them closely. Now, unable to sleep, she opened one at random. It was a communication protocol document about a multilingual AI project, dated just months before her father died. She'd never paid much attention to it before, but now something caught her eye. At the bottom of the page was a signature, not her father's. Someone else had signed off on the final version. The name made her hands still on the keyboard. Edward Lansbury. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Why would Edward have been involved in a United Nations linguistic project? His company was tech-focused, but she'd never heard of him working in translation or communication technology. At least not in any official capacity. Naomi pulled up another document, then another. As she dug deeper into her father's files, a pattern emerged. Multiple projects, all related to language and communication technology, all with some connection to Lansbury Tech. Her father had never mentioned working with Edward Lansbury, at least not that she remembered, but these documents suggested otherwise. A chill ran down her spine. Was this coincidence? Or had Edward recognized something about her that she hadn't realized herself? Was that why his challenge last night had felt so specifically pointed? She glanced at the clock. 3 in the morning. In a few hours, she'd have to return to that restaurant, to that world where Edward Lansbury was beginning to see her as more than just a waitress, and she had no idea what that might mean. Naomi closed the laptop and tried to steady her breathing. Whatever was happening, she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The question now was whether she'd revealed too much or not enough. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Truth connects. Lies divide. She'd told the truth. She could speak Mandarin. She could speak Arabic. She was more than Edward Lansbury had assumed. But the truth, she was beginning to realize, came with complications she hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow would bring answers, or more questions. Either way, Naomi knew one thing for certain. The game had changed, and she was no longer content to remain invisible. She lay back down, staring at the ceiling, and whispered a phrase in Mandarin, a saying her father had taught her years ago. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. She just hoped she was ready for whatever lessons were coming. After discovering Edward's signature on her father's documents, Naomi returned to work the next evening, with a knot of anxiety in her chest. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and questions that had no easy answers. The restaurant buzzed with unusual energy. A lavish investor dinner was scheduled for tonight, complete with journalists documenting Edward's latest philanthropic initiative. Lila had warned the entire staff that everything needed to be perfect. As Naomi tied her apron in the staff room, one of the other waitresses whispered, "I heard Mr. Lansbury specifically requested you for his table tonight." Naomi's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Then I'd better make sure everything is perfect." The evening crowd arrived in waves of designer suits and cocktail dresses. Camera crews set up in discreet corners, capturing footage for whatever PR campaign Edward was orchestrating. Naomi recognized a few faces from business magazines and news channels. At the center of it all sat Edward Lansbury, holding court like a king among courtiers. His table was the largest, positioned where everyone could see him. A dozen guests surrounded him, including several Chinese investors, a Russian business partner, and representatives from a Middle Eastern investment fund. Naomi approached with water and menus, her movements calm despite the cameras and attention. "Good evening, Mr. Lansbury. Welcome." Edward looked up at her, and she saw calculation in his eyes. Whatever his assistant had found in her background, it had only deepened his interest. "Ah, Naomi. Perfect timing." He gestured expansively to his guests. "I was just telling everyone about our fascinating staff here at the Lansbury Hotel. So talented, so diverse." The way he said it made her skin prickle. This was a setup. She distributed menus and poured water, aware of every eye on her. The journalists had noticed Edward's attention and were turning their cameras in her direction. Edward let the anticipation build as his guests perused the menus. Then, just as Naomi finished pouring the last glass, he spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "You know, I made a rather generous offer to our friend Naomi here the other night. $100,000 if she could serve me in Chinese." He paused for effect. She claimed she could speak Mandarin. So tonight, with all of you as witnesses, Let's see if she was telling the truth. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped. Conversations at other tables ceased. Even the piano player seemed to soften his touch on the keys. Edward leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Go ahead, Naomi. Take our orders in Mandarin. Let's see how fluent you really are." Every camera in the room swiveled toward her. Naomi felt the weight of dozens of stares, the pressure of the moment. This was no longer about a private challenge. Edward had turned it into a public spectacle, designed to humiliate her if she failed, or to minimize her success if she didn't. But Naomi had learned something from her father. Real power wasn't about dominating others. It was about maintaining your own dignity regardless of circumstances. She took a breath, centered herself, and then spoke in flawless Mandarin. Her words flowed naturally as she addressed the Chinese investors first, using the formal register appropriate for business elders. She welcomed them, asked about their preferences, and explained the evening's specials with perfect tonal inflection. But she didn't stop there. She noted the regional accent of one investor and seamlessly shifted her dialect to match, showing respect for his specific background. When she spoke to another, she incorporated classical idioms about prosperity and good fortune, traditional phrases that delighted the older gentleman. The Chinese investors exchanged glances of genuine surprise. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair, responded in Mandarin. "Your accent is remarkable. Where did you study?" Naomi answered smoothly, explaining in Mandarin that her father had been a translator and had taught her from childhood. The conversation continued naturally, with Naomi taking orders and answering questions about the menu with the ease of someone completely comfortable in the language. Edward's smirk had frozen on his face. He'd expected basic phrases, maybe some stumbling attempts at pronunciation. This level of fluency hadn't been in his calculations. The Russian businessman leaned toward Edward and muttered, "Her Mandarin is better than yours, Edward, by a considerable margin." A few guests chuckled nervously. Edward's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. He couldn't let this stand, couldn't let a waitress outshine him in his own restaurant, in front of cameras and investors. "Anyone can memorize phrases," he said sharply, cutting into the conversation. "Let's try something more challenging. Arabic. Speak to our Middle Eastern guests in Arabic." Naomi turned to the three men from the investment fund. She paused for just a moment, letting Edward think she might falter. Then she spoke in fluid Arabic, greeting them with formal politeness and quoting a verse about dignity and truth. The eldest of the three men straightened in his seat, clearly impressed. He responded in Arabic, asking where she'd learned such refined phrasing. Naomi explained about her father's work at the United Nations, how she'd grown up surrounded by diplomats and translators from every corner of the world. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Naomi taking their orders and discussing menu options in Arabic. The men were clearly charmed, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine warmth. By now, more than half the restaurant had stopped eating to watch. Other diners had pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. The journalists were capturing everything, their cameras trained on Naomi's poised face and Edward's increasingly agitated expression. "All right, that's enough," Edward snapped. But one of his other guests, a woman from France, called out in French, asking if Naomi spoke it as well. Naomi responded in perfect Parisian French, then switched to the woman's regional accent when she detected the subtle differences. The French guest laughed with delight. Someone else asked about Spanish. Naomi obliged, her Castilian pronunciation flawless. Then Russian. Then Swahili, impressing an African entrepreneur who'd been quietly observing from a neighboring table. The restaurant had transformed into something between a performance and a revelation. Guests from other tables called out languages, testing her, and Naomi responded to each with natural competence. Italian, Portuguese. She moved between them with the ease of someone who didn't just speak languages but lived in them. Edward's face had gone red. His carefully orchestrated evening was slipping from his control, the spotlight shifting from him to the waitress he'd meant to humiliate. "Enough!" His voice cracked like a whip. The room fell silent. "This is very impressive, I'm sure, but we're here for dinner, not a circus act." The insult hung in the air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One of the journalists, a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook, was scribbling furiously. Edward pulled out his checkbook with sharp, angry movements. He scrawled across it and tore the check free, slapping it on the table. $100,000. Just like I promised. But before you take it, prove one more thing. He reached into his briefcase and extracted a document, sliding it across the table toward Naomi. "Translate this. Right here. Right now. If you can do it accurately, the money is yours." Naomi picked up the document with steady hands. As her eyes scanned the first page, her blood went cold. It was written in a rare dialect, a specialized form of Mandarin used in certain academic and diplomatic circles. But that wasn't what made her freeze. The document was about linguistic communication algorithms, artificial intelligence translation protocols, and neural language processing. And in the margins, in handwriting she'd recognize anywhere, were her father's notes. This was her father's work, the research he'd been conducting for the United Nations in the months before he died. She'd seen fragments of it in the files on her laptop, but never the complete document. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pages. How did Edward have this? Why did he have her father's research? She looked up at him, and something in her expression must have shone through, because his smirk widened. He knew this meant something to her. He was testing her, but not in the way everyone else believed. "Problem?" Edward asked, his tone sharp. "Can't read it after all?" Naomi's mind raced. She could translate it, every word. She'd helped her father with portions of this research before he died. But doing so would reveal that she recognized it, that she knew exactly what this document was and what it represented. The room waited in breathless silence. Cameras recorded every second. The check sat on the table like a challenge and a trap combined. Naomi made her decision. She began to read aloud, translating from the complex dialect into clear English. Her voice was steady as she explained the technical concepts about using artificial intelligence to break down language barriers, to create systems that could translate not just words but cultural context and emotional nuance. As she read deeper into the document, she began to notice things. Sections that should have been there were missing. Her father's conclusions about ethical implementation, about ensuring the technology served humanity rather than corporate interests. Those pages were absent. And where her father's signature should have been at the bottom, certifying his work, there was instead a patent application filed under Lansbury Tech's name. Naomi's voice caught for just a moment. Then she continued, translating the final sections that outlined how this technology could revolutionize global communication. When she finished, she carefully set the document down and looked directly at Edward. "The translation is complete," she said quietly, "but this document is incomplete. Sections are missing." Edward's expression flickered with something between surprise and anger. "That's not your concern. You were asked to translate, not critique. I'm simply noting that the original research was more comprehensive." She kept her voice level, professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "The author had additional conclusions about ethical implementation that aren't included here." "And how would you know that?" Edward's tone was dangerous now. The entire restaurant held its breath. Naomi stood at a crossroads. She could back down, take the money, and walk away. Or she could speak the truth that was burning in her throat. "Because my father wrote this," she said clearly. His name was Andre Brooks. He was a United Nations interpreter and researcher. and this was his work. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city, sounds from outside seemed to fade away. Edward's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. Your father was a consultant. The intellectual property belongs to Lansbury Tech. We funded the research. Funding doesn't erase authorship, Naomi replied, and it doesn't give you the right to remove the ethical guidelines he established. One of the journalists stood up, her camera still rolling. Other guests were whispering urgently to each other. The Chinese investors looked troubled, clearly recognizing the implications of what had just been revealed. Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This dinner is over, everyone out. Now. But no one moved. The spell had been broken, and something larger than a simple dinner had been exposed. Lila appeared at Naomi's side, her presence solid and supportive. I think you should take your break, she said quietly to Naomi. I'll handle the rest of the evening. Naomi nodded, her composure finally beginning to crack. She left the check on the table, untouched, and walked toward the staff area with as much dignity as she could muster. The staff room was empty and blessedly quiet. Naomi sank onto the bench, her whole body trembling, now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd just confronted Edward Lansbury in front of investors, journalists, and cameras. She'd accused him of stealing her father's work. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew her life had just changed irrevocably. The door opened and Lila entered, closing it firmly behind her. She sat down beside Naomi without speaking, simply offering her presence. I'm probably fired, Naomi said, her voice shaking. Maybe, maybe not. Lila's tone was thoughtful. But either way, that took courage. Naomi let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. Courage or stupidity. I needed this job. Did you mean what you said about your father writing that document? Every word. Naomi looked at Lila, tears finally spilling over. I didn't know Edward had it. I didn't know he'd patented my father's research under his own company's name. I found his signature on some of my dad's old files just last night, but I didn't understand the full scope until I saw that document. Lila was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke carefully. I worked for Lansbury Tech once, in public relations, about 5 years ago. Naomi turned to look at her fully. I left because of an ethics scandal, Lila continued. Edward acquired a small startup, claimed he'd bought all their intellectual property legitimately. But several of the original founders said he'd stolen their work, that he'd forced them out and then patented their innovations under his name. What happened? The case was settled out of court. Non-disclosure agreements all around. But I couldn't stay after that. I couldn't keep spinning stories to cover up what I knew was theft. Lila met Naomi's eyes. If your father's work was taken the same way, you deserve to know the truth. How do I prove it? It's been 3 years, and I'm just a waitress with no resources to fight someone like Edward Lansbury. You're not just a waitress, Lila said firmly. You're a linguistics scholar who speaks 9 languages and whose father was a respected UN researcher. That's who you are. Don't let anyone, including yourself, diminish that. Naomi wiped her eyes. Thank you. A knock at the door made them both turn. Clara Wells, the journalist who'd been taking notes all evening, poked her head in. She was in her mid-30s with intelligent eyes and an air of determined professionalism. I'm sorry to intrude. May I speak with you, Naomi? Naomi looked at Lila, who nodded. Clara entered and closed the door behind her. That was remarkable, Clara said without preamble. And I don't just mean your language skills. What you revealed about that document could be significant. Could be? Naomi's voice was hollow. It won't matter. He's a billionaire. I'm nobody. You're someone who just told the truth in front of cameras and witnesses. That matters. Clara pulled out a business card. I write for the Times. Human interest stories usually, but I also cover corporate accountability. If you're willing to talk, really talk, I'd like to help you tell your story. Why would you help me? Because I've been watching Edward Lansbury operate for years, and I've never been able to pin down his shadier dealings. But tonight, you handed me a thread I can pull. Clara's expression softened, and because what he did to you tonight was cruel. The whole setup was designed to humiliate you, and instead you showed grace and intelligence and truth. That deserves to be recognized. Naomi looked at the business card, then at Lila, then back to Clara. If I do this, I'll lose everything. My job, any chance of working in hospitality again, maybe you'll lose those things, Clara interrupted gently. Or maybe you'll gain something more important. Justice, recognition, the truth about your father's legacy. The weight of the decision pressed down on Naomi. She thought about her mother's medical bills, about the rent due next week, about the practical realities of survival. But she also thought about her father's voice in those recordings, about his belief that truth was the foundation of all real communication. I have files, Naomi said slowly. My father's old research notes, audio recordings where he talks about his work. I don't know if it's enough proof, but it's something. Clara's eyes lit up. That's exactly what we need. Would you be willing to share them with me? Naomi pulled out her phone, navigating to the folder of her father's files. She'd backed everything up to cloud storage years ago, just to preserve his memory. Now those memories might serve a larger purpose. She pulled out a USB drive from her bag. She'd started carrying copies of everything after last night's discovery, and handed it to Clara. This has everything. Audio files, research notes, correspondence, just in case. Just in case of what? Clara asked. Just in case something happens to me. Or to the original files. I don't trust Edward not to try something. Clara's expression grew serious. That's smart thinking. I'll keep this secure. She paused. For what it's worth, I don't think Edward will retaliate directly. He's too smart for that. But he will try to discredit you. Be prepared for that. I've been discredited my whole life just by existing, Naomi said quietly. At least this time it's for speaking truth. After Clara left, Naomi sat alone in the staff room for a long while. Her shift was technically over. She should go home, try to sleep, figure out what came next. But her body felt too heavy to move. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Farouk Hassan. Naomi, I saw something online, a video from the Lansbury Hotel. Was that you? Please call me when you can. Of course. The videos had already started circulating. Within hours, her confrontation with Edward would probably be everywhere. She called him back. Naomi. Dr. Hassan's voice was warm but concerned. What happened tonight? She explained everything. The challenge, the languages, the document, the revelation about her father's stolen research. It all poured out of her in a rush of words. When she finished, Dr. Hassan was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. Naomi, I need to tell you something. I knew your father. Not well, but we met several times at conferences. He mentioned working on a communication project funded by a tech company. But he was concerned about how they wanted to use his research. Concerned how? He felt they were more interested in commercial applications than humanitarian ones. He wanted the technology to help refugees, immigrants, people who struggled with language barriers, but the company wanted to monetize it, to create proprietary systems that would require licensing fees. Naomi's hands tightened around her phone. Did he say which company? He never named them specifically. But he did say the CEO was a man who saw language as a commodity rather than a bridge. Dr. Hassan paused. Based on what you've told me, I think he was talking about Edward Lansbury. Why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't connect it until tonight. And honestly, after your father died, I assumed the project had been abandoned. His voice grew firmer. But if Edward patented your father's work, If he's using it without proper attribution or adhering to your father's ethical guidelines, that's not just wrong. It's theft of intellectual property. How do I prove that? The documents you have are a start, but you'll need more. Academic papers your father published, correspondence, anything that shows his original intent and authorship. Dr. Hassan hesitated. Naomi, this could get complicated. Edward Lansbury has resources and lawyers. Are you prepared for that fight? I don't know, she admitted. But I can't let my father's work be erased. I can't let Edward profit from something he stole while pretending it was his innovation. Then I'll help however I can. I still have connections in the academic community, people who knew your father's work. We can build a case for proper attribution at minimum. After the call ended, Naomi finally forced herself to stand. She changed out of her work uniform, folded it carefully, and left it in her locker. She didn't know if she'd be coming back tomorrow. The subway ride home felt surreal. She kept expecting to feel regret or fear, but instead she felt a strange sense of clarity. For 3 years, she'd been hiding, surviving, diminishing herself to fit into spaces that didn't value her. Tonight, she'd stopped hiding. Back in her apartment, she opened her laptop and pulled up all of her father's files. She organized them methodically: research notes, audio recordings, email correspondence, conference presentations. Everything that proved Andre Brooks had been working on multilingual AI communication systems years before Edward Lansbury claimed the innovation. As she worked, she played one of her father's recordings. His voice filled the small apartment, talking about his vision for the project. Language shouldn't be a barrier, Naomi. It should be a bridge. This technology we're developing could help millions of people connect across cultures, but only if it's used ethically, with respect for the communities it serves. I'm worried about my partners, though. They keep talking about market share and licensing agreements. They don't understand that some things are more important than profit. Naomi paused the recording, tears streaming down her face. Her father had known. He'd known Edward and his company couldn't be trusted with this work. And then he'd died, and Edward had taken everything. She resumed the recording. If anything happens to me, I need you to know where all my research is stored. I've kept backup copies of everything, including the ethical guidelines I insisted on. They're in the UN archives under project designation LB 2047. Remember that number, Naomi. LB 2047. That's the proof of what this project was meant to be. Naomi stopped breathing. Her father had left a trail. Evidence stored in official archives that would show his original work, his ethical framework. Everything Edward had removed or altered. She grabbed her phone and texted Dr. Hassan. My father mentioned UN archives. Project LB 2047. Can you help me access those records? His response came quickly. I can try. I'll reach out to my contacts at the UN tomorrow. This could be exactly what we need. Naomi looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built from the ruins of her dreams. Tomorrow, everything might change again. Edward would almost certainly try to destroy her credibility. The videos from tonight would spread across social media, and people would judge and comment and dissect every moment. But for the first time in 3 years, Naomi felt like herself again. Not a waitress hiding her past. Not a scholar forced into silence. Just someone willing to speak truth no matter the cost. She opened her father's photo on the table and spoke to him quietly. I'm going to finish what you started, Dad. I'm going to make sure your work gets the recognition it deserves. And I'm going to make sure Edward Lansbury can't erase you from history. The city hummed outside her window. Somewhere out there, Edward was probably planning his counterattack. Clara was likely writing her article. The world was shifting in ways Naomi couldn't fully predict. But she was ready. For truth. For justice. For whatever came next. She pulled up the video someone had already posted online. The clip showed her speaking in multiple languages, calm and poised, while Edward grew increasingly agitated. The comments section was exploding with reactions. Who is this woman? She destroyed that arrogant billionaire with pure class. This is what real intelligence looks like. Wait, did she say he stole her father's research? Someone investigate this. Naomi closed her laptop. The story was already writing itself. Now she just had to make sure the truth didn't get buried under Edward's money and influence. She lay down on her bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight, she'd honored her father's memory and her own integrity. That, she decided, was enough. The viral videos from the restaurant had been circulating for 3 days when Naomi received an unexpected call from Edward Lansbury's personal assistant. She was sitting in her apartment, reviewing documents with Dr. Hassan via video call, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Ms. Brooks, Mr. Lansbury would like to extend a personal invitation to dinner at his residence tomorrow evening at 7. He wishes to apologize for the misunderstanding and discuss a potential opportunity with Lansbury Tech. Naomi's grip tightened on her phone. An opportunity? Mr. Lansbury is impressed by your linguistic abilities. He'd like to discuss sponsoring your talents through our new AI communication division. After she hung up, Dr. Hassan's face on the laptop screen showed deep concern. Naomi, this feels like a trap. I know. But maybe it's also a chance to get more information, to understand what he really wants. Or it's a chance for him to intimidate you privately, away from cameras and witnesses. Naomi thought about this. Then I'll make sure someone knows where I am and when to expect me back. She called Lila, who immediately voiced the same concerns. It's not an apology, Naomi. It's a test. Edward doesn't apologize. He manipulates. What would you do? Lila was quiet for a moment. I'd go. But I'd record everything. And I'd tell multiple people exactly where you are and when you'll check in. The next evening, Naomi stood outside Edward's penthouse building in Tribeca. The structure was all glass and steel, towering above the neighborhood like a monument to wealth. She'd dressed carefully in simple black pants and a white blouse, professional but not trying too hard. A doorman escorted her to a private elevator that opened directly into Edward's penthouse. The space was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic city views, minimalist furniture, and walls lined with awards and artifacts from around the world. African masks next to Chinese pottery, next to what appeared to be ancient Greek fragments. Objects collected without understanding, displayed without context. Edward emerged from a hallway, dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt. His smile was warm, but didn't reach his eyes. Naomi, thank you for coming. Please sit. He gestured to a dining area where champagne sat chilling in a bucket. I thought we could clear the air. The other night got out of hand. It was certainly memorable, Naomi replied, not sitting yet. Edward poured 2 glasses of champagne, offering her one. She accepted but didn't drink. He noticed and his smile tightened slightly. I'll be direct. You impressed me. Your linguistic abilities are extraordinary and I was wrong to dismiss them, or you so casually. He sipped his champagne. I want to make amends. Lansbury Tech is developing a new AI communication platform. We need someone with your skills, your understanding of cultural nuance. I'd like to offer you a position as our chief linguistic consultant. Naomi studied him carefully. That's generous, but I'm curious why you'd offer a job to someone who publicly accused you of stealing her father's research. Edward's jaw tightened. That was a misunderstanding born from emotion. Your father consulted on a project we funded. We own the intellectual property, which is standard practice, but I understand you were upset. Where I come from, we call authorship what it is. My father created that research. Your signature on the patent doesn't change who did the work. Your father was well compensated for his time. Was he? Naomi's voice remained calm. Because after he died, we received nothing. No residuals, no recognition, nothing that acknowledged his 3 years of work. Edward's artificial warmth was fading. He was a consultant. Consultants don't receive royalties. And yet you've made millions from his algorithms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Edward set down his glass with more force than necessary. Let's discuss this somewhere more private. He led her to a study lined with mahogany shelves and leather-bound books. A large desk dominated the space, covered with folders and documents. Edward closed the door behind them. I'll be honest now, he said, his voice harder. Those videos from the restaurant have caused problems. Investors are asking questions. My board is concerned about optics. I need this situation resolved. Resolved how? He slid a folder across the desk toward her. This is a contract. You'll receive a substantial signing bonus, a generous salary, and the title I mentioned. In exchange, you'll sign a statement acknowledging that your father's work was done under contract to Lansbury Tech, and that all intellectual property rightfully belongs to the company. Naomi opened the folder. The contract was thick, filled with legal language, but she spotted the key clauses quickly. Non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement clauses, a complete waiver of any future claims related to her father's work. This isn't a job offer. It's a silencing agreement. It's a resolution, one that benefits everyone. Edward's tone grew sharper. Do you understand what you're up against? I have attorneys who could tie you up in court for years. I could destroy your credibility with a single press release. That journalism friend of yours? One call from my PR team and her article never sees print. Clara isn't afraid of you. Everyone should be afraid of me. Edward leaned forward, his mask slipping completely. You're a waitress with no money, no connections, and no real proof of anything. Your father's dead. His notes are circumstantial at best. Meanwhile, I have patents, contracts, and a legal team that's never lost. Naomi met his gaze steadily. She'd come prepared for this. In her pocket, her phone was recording everything. Clara was waiting for a check-in call. Dr. Hassan had backup copies of all the files. And most importantly, they'd found the UN archives that morning. Project LB 2047 contained her father's original research, complete with his ethical guidelines that Edward had removed. You're right that I don't have your resources, Naomi said quietly. But I have something you don't. The truth. And the willingness to speak it, no matter the cost. Edward's face flushed red. The truth? You want to talk about truth? Your father was brilliant, I'll give him that. But he was naive. He thought language should be free, accessible to everyone. He didn't understand that innovation requires investment, that nothing worthwhile is free. So you stole his work and erased his name. I acquired intellectual property through legal means. Edward's voice rose. He signed contracts. He knew the terms. Did he know you'd remove every mention of ethics? That you'd turn his humanitarian vision into a profit machine? Business requires pragmatism. Your father wanted to give away technology that cost millions to develop. I turned it into something viable, something that actually exists in the world rather than dying as an idealistic dream. Naomi stood slowly. Inside her pocket, her phone captured every word. My father believed language was a bridge. You've turned it into a commodity. That's not pragmatism. It's betrayal. Get out. Edward's composure shattered. He grabbed his champagne glass and hurled it against the wall. Crystal shattered, champagne streaming down the expensive wallpaper. You people think knowing a few words makes you equal. You think you can walk into my world and demand respect. You're nothing. The words echoed in the study. Naomi stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. This was the real Edward Lansbury, Not the polished billionaire, but the insecure man beneath who needed to diminish others to feel powerful. "You're right," she said softly, switching to Mandarin. "I am nothing by your standards, but empires fall when they stop listening." She walked to the door and opened it. Edward stood frozen, his face twisted with rage and something else. The dawning realization that he'd just revealed himself completely. Naomi left without another word, her hand steady on the recording device in her pocket. As the elevator descended, she exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, the world would hear exactly who Edward Lansbury was behind his carefully crafted image. Clara's article appeared online at 6 in the morning. The headline read, "The Waitress Who Spoke 9 Languages and Exposed a Billionaire's Theft." Naomi woke to her phone exploding with notifications, messages from former classmates, old colleagues of her father's, people she hadn't heard from in years. But more than that, strangers from around the world were sharing the article, commenting, amplifying the story. Clara had woven everything together masterfully. The restaurant confrontation, Naomi's background, her father's stolen research, and most devastatingly, the audio recording from Edward's penthouse. His voice crystal clear, admitting he'd removed Andre Brooks's ethical guidelines. His rage-filled outburst about "you people." His complete collapse into the prejudice he usually kept, hidden. The audio clip went viral within hours. News outlets picked up the story. Social media platforms flooded with reactions. Hashtags emerged. "More justice for Andre. Such speak truth. Such language is a bridge." Lila called at 7. "Have you seen the news? I can't look away from it. Investors are pulling out of Lansbury Tech. 3 major partnerships dissolved overnight. The board called an emergency meeting." Lila's voice carried a grim satisfaction. "Edward's empire is crumbling." By midday, Edward held a press conference. Naomi watched it on her laptop, Clara sitting beside her in the apartment they'd agreed was safer than Naomi being alone. Edward stood behind a podium, his usual confidence strained. "Recent allegations have suggested impropriety in my company's acquisition of certain intellectual property. I want to be clear, all of Lansbury Tech's patents and innovations were obtained through legal means. We value the contributions of all our consultants, including the late Andre Brooks." A reporter shouted over the others. "Mr. Lansbury, in the audio recording, you admit removing ethical guidelines from Brooks's original research. How is that legal?" Edward's jaw clenched. "That recording was obtained without my knowledge or consent. It may not even be authentic. We're exploring all legal remedies." "Are you denying you said those things?" "I'm saying the context was distorted. This is a personal attack by a disgruntled former employee seeking financial gain." Another reporter. "Naomi Brooks was never your employee. She was a waitress at your hotel, and she refused the $100,000 payment you offered. How does that align with seeking financial gain?" The press conference devolved into chaos. Edward's answers became defensive, contradictory. His carefully maintained image cracked further with each question. Clara closed the laptop. "He's done. Even if the legal system protects him, public opinion won't." "Will the legal system protect him?" Naomi asked. "Honestly, maybe. Rich men have insulated themselves with lawyers and contracts for centuries." Clara's expression hardened. "But Dr. Hassan's UN contacts came through. The archives prove your father's original research included those ethical guidelines. They prove his authorship. That's enough to start a formal investigation into intellectual property theft." Naomi's phone rang. Dr. Hassan's name appeared on the screen. "Naomi, I have news. The UN's Ethics Committee is launching an inquiry into Project LB 2047. Edward's company received substantial grants based on promises to implement Andre's humanitarian framework. If they diverted that money to commercial purposes while removing the ethical components, that's not just theft, it's fraud. What does that mean? It means government agencies will get involved. This isn't just about credit or money anymore. This is about misuse of international development funds. Within days, the situation accelerated beyond anything Naomi had imagined. Major investors abandoned Lansbury Tech publicly, issuing statements about ethical concerns. The company's stock price plummeted. Authorities raided the corporate offices, seizing files and computer servers. Naomi watched it unfold with mixed feelings. She'd wanted recognition for her father's work, wanted Edward held accountable. But seeing an empire collapse was surreal, almost frightening in its speed and totality. A week after Clara's article published, Naomi returned to the Lansbury Hotel. Not to work. Lila had called to say the entire management structure was being reorganized, but to retrieve her personal items from her locker. The restaurant was closed for renovations. The space looked different in daylight, smaller somehow. She walked to where Edward's table had been, where everything had started with his mocking challenge. The piano sat silent in the corner. She remembered how the music had stopped when Edward made his offer, how the entire room had held its breath. Now the room was empty except for her footsteps. Naomi. She turned. Lila stood in the doorway, dressed casually for once instead of her usual manager's attire. "I thought you might come by," Lila said. "I wanted you to know. The new ownership is completely restructuring. They're committed to ethical business practices, fair wages, and respecting every employee." New ownership? Edward's being forced to sell. His remaining assets are being liquidated to cover legal fees and settlements. Lila walked closer. "They want to rename the restaurant. They asked if you had any suggestions." Naomi looked around the space where she'd been invisible for so long, where she'd served people who never saw her, where she'd hidden her true self to survive, and where, finally, she'd refused to stay silent. "Brooks Hall," she said quietly, "after my father." Lila smiled. "I'll suggest it. I think they'll like it." She paused. "What will you do now?" Naomi had been asking herself the same question. Job offers had started arriving, universities wanting her to lecture, nonprofits focused on linguistic access, even tech companies developing ethical AI. The world that had closed its doors when her father died was suddenly opening them again. But more than any specific opportunity, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: freedom. The freedom to choose her path instead of scrambling for survival. The freedom to honor her father's legacy on her own terms. "I'm going to finish my degree," Naomi said, "and then I'm going to continue my father's work, the way he intended it. Language is a bridge, not a barrier. Technology that serves people, not profits. He'd be proud of you." "I hope so." As Naomi left the hotel for the last time, she passed a television in the lobby. A news anchor was reporting on the ongoing investigation into Lansbury Tech. Edward's face filled the screen, no longer confident and commanding, but haggard and defensive. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet sense of completion. This had never been about revenge. It had been about truth, about refusing to let her father's voice be erased from history. Outside, the city moved with its usual relentless energy. Naomi stood on the sidewalk, feeling the autumn sun on her face. Somewhere in the crowd, people were speaking dozens of languages, each one carrying stories and dreams and struggles. Her phone buzzed with a text from Clara. UN committee officially credited Andre Brooks as the primary author of Project LB 2047. Full recognition. Full vindication. You did it. Naomi read the message twice, then looked up at the sky. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. For the first time in 3 years, the weight she'd been carrying lifted. Not completely. Grief and loss don't disappear, but enough that she could breathe fully, could imagine a future built on something other than survival. She pulled out her father's old notebook from her bag, the one filled with linguistic notes in multiple languages. On a blank page, she wrote in careful Mandarin characters, "Truth connects, lies divide, Below it she added in English, "And speaking truth no matter the cost is how we honor those we love." A young couple walked past her, speaking Arabic. She understood every word. They were lost, looking for a specific restaurant. Naomi approached them with a smile. "Excuse me," she said in Arabic. "I can help you find where you're going." Their faces lit up with relief and gratitude. As she gave them directions, the man said, "Your Arabic is beautiful. Where did you learn?" "My father taught me," Naomi replied. "He believed language was the most powerful tool we have for understanding each other." "Your father was wise." "Yes," Naomi agreed, her heart full. "Yes, he was." She watched them walk away, then continued down the street herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to build the bridges her father had envisioned. But today, in this moment, she allowed herself to simply be. A woman who spoke 9 languages, a daughter honoring her father's memory, a voice that refused to be silenced, and that, she decided, was exactly enough. 3 months after Edward's empire began crumbling, Naomi stood in her apartment, holding an embossed invitation. The United Nations was hosting a global summit on linguistic unity and digital ethics, and they wanted her as a keynote speaker. Her hands trembled as she read the formal request. The same institution where her father had worked, where he'd built bridges between nations through words, was now inviting her to continue his legacy. She called Dr. Hassan immediately. "I don't know if I can do this. Speaking at the UN, that's not who I am." "That's exactly who you are," he replied gently. "You've already spoken truth to power in front of cameras and the world. This is just a larger stage for the same courage. What if I freeze? What if I'm not eloquent enough? Naomi, you speak 9 languages fluently. Eloquence isn't your problem, fear is, and you've already proven you're braver than your fear." The next day, Lila met her for coffee. The friendship that had formed during the crisis had deepened into something genuine. Lila had left the Lansbury Hotel entirely and was exploring new opportunities. "I have news," Lila said, sliding a folder across the table. "Remember how I said the new owners wanted to restructure? They've asked me to manage a nonprofit division focused on hospitality training for immigrants and refugees. That's wonderful. And they want you on the advisory board. They're calling it the Andre Brooks Foundation for Linguistic Empowerment." Lila's eyes were bright. "They want to use your father's vision, language as a bridge, to create opportunities for people who've been marginalized." Naomi opened the folder. Inside were plans for training programs, scholarship opportunities, and partnerships with community organizations. Her father's face smiled from a memorial page, his biography written with respect and accuracy. "This is beautiful," Naomi whispered. "It's what he deserved. What you both deserve." That afternoon, Clara stopped by Naomi's apartment with a printed copy of her follow-up article. The piece was titled, "She Didn't Want Fame, She Wanted Fairness." "This one's different," Clara explained. "The first article exposed Edward. This one celebrates your father's legacy and your courage. I wanted people to understand the full story, not just the confrontation, but the love and principle behind it." Naomi read through the article, tears blurring her vision. Clara had interviewed Dr. Hassan, former UN colleagues of her father's, even some of Naomi's old professors from Columbia. Each person spoke about Andre Brooks's brilliance, his kindness, his unwavering belief that language could heal divisions, and they spoke about Naomi, not as a victim or a hero, but as a daughter honoring her father's memory with grace and strength. "It's perfect," Naomi said. "Thank you. Thank you for trusting me with your story." Clara paused. "For what it's worth, this is the most important piece I've ever written. It reminded me why I became a journalist, to amplify voices that deserve to be heard." As the weeks passed, Naomi prepared for her UN speech. She wrote and rewrote, trying to capture everything she wanted to say about language, connection, and her father's vision. But every draft felt inadequate. One evening, frustrated and exhausted, she visited her father's grave for the first time since the whole ordeal began. The cemetery was quiet, autumn leaves scattered across the grass. She sat beside his headstone and spoke to him as if he could hear. "I don't know what to say to all those people, Dad. I'm not you. I'm not a diplomat or a scholar or someone who naturally inspires others." She wiped her eyes. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent when it mattered. Is that enough?" The wind rustled through the trees. In her pocket, her phone held dozens of voice memos, her father's recorded lessons and encouragement. She pulled it out and played one she'd marked months ago. Her father's voice emerged, warm and familiar. "Naomi, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. When you speak from your authentic self, when you share your truth without pretense, people listen. Not because you're extraordinary, but because you're real." She sat with those words until the sun began to set. Then she went home and wrote her speech in one sitting, not as an academic or an activist, but as herself. A daughter, a former waitress, a woman who'd found her voice by refusing to lose it. The day of the summit arrived with crisp winter air and clear skies. Naomi dressed carefully in a navy suit her mother had helped her pick out. Her mother, whose health had improved with better treatment now that Naomi could afford it, hugged her tightly before she left. "Your father would burst with pride," her mother said, tears in her eyes. At the UN building, Naomi felt overwhelmed by the grandeur. Delegates from every corner of the world filled the assembly hall. Cameras lined the walls. Translation headphones hung on every seat. Dr. Hassan met her backstage. "Nervous?" "Terrified." "Good. That means it matters to you." He smiled. "Your father used to say the same thing before big presentations. He'd be shaking with nerves, then step onto the stage and transform into the most confident person in the room." Lila appeared with Clara beside her. Both had flown in to support her. "You've got this," Lila said simply. Clara squeezed her hand. "Just speak from your heart. That's what people need to hear." When Naomi's name was called, she walked onto the stage with legs that felt unsteady but steps that didn't falter. The assembly hall stretched before her, hundreds of faces turned in her direction. She reached the podium and looked out at the audience. Then she began. "Good morning, buenos dias, bonjour, sabah al-khair, zhao shang hao." She spoke the greeting in 9 languages, her voice steady and clear. The audience stirred with interest. "My name is Naomi Brooks, and my father was Andre Brooks. Many of you knew him. He worked in this building for 15 years, translating, interpreting, bridging gaps between people who thought they had nothing in common." She paused, finding her rhythm. "I'm not here today because I'm special. I'm here because I learned something important from a painful experience. Language is power, but not the kind of power that dominates or diminishes. It's the power to connect, to understand, to see our shared humanity across every border and barrier we construct." She switched to Mandarin, addressing the Chinese delegates directly. She quoted a classical phrase about unity and diversity. Then she moved to Arabic, speaking about the ancient tradition of hospitality and welcoming strangers. French, Spanish, Russian, Swahili. She wove between languages naturally, making every delegate feel seen and included. "My father believed that technology could amplify this power," she continued in English. "He envisioned systems that would help refugees communicate with doctors, that would let isolated elders connect with their grandchildren across continents, that would break down the walls language builds between us." Her voice grew stronger. "But he also understood that technology is only as ethical as the people who control it. When innovation serves profit over people, when it becomes a commodity instead of a bridge, we lose what makes us human. We lose empathy." She told her story then, not dwelling on the pain, but focusing on the principle. She spoke about working as a waitress while hiding her education and abilities, about the challenge that forced her to choose between silence and truth, about discovering her father's stolen work and deciding to speak up despite the cost. I didn't expose Edward Lansbury because I wanted revenge. I did it because my father's voice deserved to be heard, and because silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. The assembly hall was completely still. Every eye was fixed on her. When power speaks, it often divides us. It tells us we're different, separate, unequal. But when empathy speaks, when we choose understanding over judgment, connection over isolation, we remember that we're all trying to navigate the same human experience. We're all searching for dignity, for purpose, for the simple right to be heard. She ended her speech with her father's favorite phrase, spoken in each of the 9 languages. Language is not a wall between us, it's a window. And every time we open one, we see a little more of ourselves. The assembly erupted in applause. Delegates rose to their feet, the ovation thundering through the hall. Naomi stood at the podium, overwhelmed by emotion, and felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. As she left the stage, delegates surrounded her. A woman from Kenya asked about starting similar linguistic programs in her country. A Japanese official wanted to discuss ethical AI translation. Students who'd been watching the live stream sent messages asking how they could learn from her. Dr. Hassan found her in the crowd, his eyes shining with pride. You didn't just honor your father today. You became the bridge he always knew you could be. 6 months later, Naomi stood in front of a classroom that didn't have walls. The screen before her showed 23 faces from 15 different countries, all connected through the Andre Brooks Foundation's online learning platform. Today, we're going to learn how stories translate across cultures, she said, smiling at the eager young faces. Who wants to share a folktale from their country? A girl from Morocco raised her hand, speaking in hesitant French. Naomi listened, then helped her translate the story into English, explaining the cultural context that made it meaningful. A boy from Brazil offered a Portuguese tale next, and the class worked together to find equivalent expressions in their various languages. This had become Naomi's life, teaching, connecting, building the foundation her father had dreamed of. The Andre Brooks Foundation for Linguistic Empowerment had grown rapidly, funded by ethical investors, donations from people who'd been moved by her story, and partnerships with universities worldwide. Lila served as the foundation's director of operations, her experience in hospitality management translating perfectly to coordinating global programs. Clara documented their work through articles in a book she was writing about language, justice, and the power of speaking truth. After the class ended, Naomi walked to the foundation's new headquarters, modest offices in a community center in Queens, not far from her childhood neighborhood. The walls were covered with photographs of students, maps showing their reach across continents, and a large portrait of her father that visitors always stopped to admire. On her desk sat the framed quote her father had loved. "Understanding is the truest wealth." Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Hassan. "One of your students just got accepted to Columbia's linguistics program with a full scholarship. 3 others received job offers as translators for refugee services. You're changing lives, Naomi." She smiled and texted back, "We're changing lives. This was never about me alone." That afternoon, she had an unexpected visitor. The receptionist called to say someone named Edward Lansbury was in the lobby, asking to see her. Naomi's first instinct was to refuse. She hadn't seen or spoken to Edward since that night in his penthouse. His company had been dismantled, his patents stripped, his reputation destroyed. She'd heard he'd lost most of his fortune in legal settlements and investigations, but curiosity, and perhaps a whisper of compassion, made her agree to meet him. Edward looked different. The polished billionaire was gone, replaced by a man in worn jeans and a simple jacket. His silver hair needed cutting. His face carried lines of exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said immediately, standing awkwardly in her office doorway. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to see what you built." Naomi gestured to a chair. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what I destroyed." He sat heavily. "I've spent 6 months in therapy, trying to figure out how I became the person I was. The person who mocked you, who stole your father's work, who built an empire on taking credit for other people's brilliance. And what did you learn? That I was afraid, terrified of being ordinary, of not mattering, so I took and took, believing that accumulation would fill the emptiness." He looked at her directly. "I destroyed your father's legacy out of greed. I destroyed your dignity out of insecurity. And I almost destroyed myself out of cowardice." Naomi listened without speaking. "I donated what's left of my money," Edward continued. "Not to your foundation, I know you wouldn't accept it from me, but to organizations like yours, under my mother's name, so it wouldn't be tainted by mine." He paused. "It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's what I can do." "Why tell me this?" "Because you deserve to know that your courage didn't just save your father's memory. It saved me from continuing to be a monster." His voice cracked. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the second chance you inadvertently gave me." Naomi studied him. She saw genuine remorse, but also the privilege of a man who would recover from ruin in ways that others never could. Yet she also saw a human being grappling with his own failures. "I can't give you absolution," she said finally. "That's not mine to give. My father's work speaks for itself now, and your role in trying to erase it is part of the public record. I know. But I hope you find a way to do better, to be better. Not for recognition, but because it's right." Edward nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Your father was brilliant. I knew it even as I was stealing his work. I'm sorry I never told him that when he was alive." After he left, Naomi sat quietly in her office. She didn't know if Edward's redemption was genuine or just another performance, but she realized it didn't matter. Her purpose wasn't about him anymore. It was about the students she taught, the bridges she built, the legacy she honored. That evening, Naomi visited the rebranded restaurant, now officially called Brooks Hall. The space had been completely redesigned with input from community members and former staff. The walls featured a mural showing children of every background, holding books that glowed with different scripts. At the center of the mural was a portrait of her father at his UN desk, headphones on, a gentle smile on his face as he translated words that would help nations understand each other. Lila met her there for dinner. They sat at a table by the window, the Manhattan skyline glittering beyond the glass. "Remember when you were invisible here?" Lila asked. "Every day. But I don't regret it anymore. That experience taught me something important, that dignity isn't given by others. It's something we carry ourselves. Your father would be so proud." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "I hope so. I try to honor him in everything I do." Later that night, back in her apartment, Naomi opened her laptop. She'd finally finished the research paper she'd abandoned 3 years ago. Language as a Bridge of Empathy. Dr. Hassan had reviewed it and submitted it for publication in a prestigious linguistics journal. But more importantly, she'd expanded it into a manifesto for the foundation. Guidelines for ethical language technology. Principles for using linguistic access as a tool for justice rather than profit. Everything her father had envisioned, now codified and ready to guide future innovations. She pulled out her father's old voice recorder and recorded a message of her own. "Dad, I did it. I finished what you started. Not exactly how you planned, maybe, but in a way that honors your vision. The foundation is growing. Students from 20 countries are learning languages, finding opportunities, building bridges just like you taught me. Her voice wavered. I miss you every day, but I'm not lost anymore. I know who I am, someone who listens, who speaks truth, who believes that understanding is the truest wealth. You taught me that, and I'll spend my life teaching it to others. She saved the recording and looked at the photo of them together at the UN, taken when she was just 16. Both of them smiling, her father's hand on her shoulder, the future bright and full of possibility. That future had taken a different path than either of them expected, but it had led her here. To purpose, to impact, to a life built on principle rather than survival. The next morning, Naomi prepared for another day of classes. But first, she stopped at a community center in the Bronx where she was teaching introductory Mandarin to recent immigrants. A young woman approached her after class, speaking nervously. "Ms. Brooks, I wanted to thank you. I came here from China 2 years ago and could barely communicate. Now I'm starting college. Because you taught me that knowing multiple languages isn't just practical. It's powerful." Naomi hugged her. "You always had that power. I just helped you see it." As she walked home through the city streets, she noticed the languages flowing around her. Spanish from a bodega owner, Arabic from teenagers laughing together, Russian from an elderly couple. All these voices, all these stories, all these people trying to be understood. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A video message from one of the foundation's students in Kenya, speaking in Swahili about how the program had helped her become a translator for her village's medical clinic. Naomi watched the video with a full heart. This was her father's dream realized, not through patents or profits, but through people connecting, understanding, and lifting each other up. She arrived at her apartment and saw a package waiting. Inside was an advance copy of Clara's book, titled Voices That Bridge, One Woman's Fight for Her Father's Legacy. On the dedication page, it read, "For Andre Brooks, who taught us that language is a window, not a wall, and for Naomi Brooks, who opened that window for the world to see through." Naomi held the book and felt the full weight of everything that had happened. The pain of loss, the courage to speak, the vindication of truth, the joy of purpose fulfilled. She opened her father's old notebook to a blank page and wrote in careful script, alternating between languages. Language is a bridge, truth is a foundation, love is the blueprint, and every word we speak can either divide or connect. I choose connection, today and always. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not the invisible waitress she'd once been, but the woman she'd become. A teacher, an advocate, a voice for those still finding theirs. And in that reflection, she saw her father's smile. The work would continue. The foundation would grow. More students would learn that their voices mattered, that understanding was possible, that bridges could be built one word at a time. This was legacy, not wealth or fame, but impact that rippled outward, touching lives in ways both visible and invisible. Naomi smiled and spoke softly in Mandarin, a phrase her father had taught her long ago. When you speak with love, the whole world understands. Outside her window, the city hummed with countless voices, each one carrying stories worth hearing. And Naomi knew that for the rest of her life, she would work to make sure those voices were heard, understood, and valued. Because that's what it meant to honor her father. That's what it meant to build bridges. That's what it meant to choose understanding over silence, connection over isolation, love over fear. And that, she decided, was the truest wealth of all. If someone stole everything your father built and then mocked you for existing, would you have the courage to speak your truth even knowing it might cost you everything you have left? If this story moved, you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay silent.